Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Longueuil, Pierre Boucher, for his strong statement today and for his motion in support of the CBC. And for those who are watching this debate, this motion is calling on Parliament to reverse the $45 million in cuts for the 2014-2015 budget and budget 2012, and to provide adequate and stable funding to the public broadcaster so that it can fulfill its mandate. Mr. Speaker, let me just say first of all why we need a CBC, and I want to begin with a quote from Canadian producer and director Peter Raymond. And what he has said is, I think the arts programming on CBC, English television in particular, could really help revitalize the CBC. There's been very little arts programming on the CBC for quite a few years now. I think it's a great shame that the artists of Canada, the musicians and poets and writers and filmmakers of Canada haven't had their voices heard and their work seen on CBC television, and it's a vital part of Canadian culture and Canadian identity. Mr. Speaker, it is still very essential that Canadians share their stories, and that's what the public broadcaster allows us to do. We need to be able to tell our stories from every corner of this vast country, not just the big cities. I come from Toronto, my riding is Parkdale-High Park, but we need to know the stories of big and small communities right across this country as part of our Canadian identity. But this government seems to not like our Canadian institutions, whether it's Elections Canada, the Supreme Court, or Canada Post, and now the CBC. These cuts seem to be part of a broader assault on our public institutions in Canada. Let's face it, our national broadcaster is part of our nation building. It is an important element of our country. We need to share our stories, and there is no private sector replacement for what the CBC does, and these cuts are preventing us from effectively telling our stories across this country. Now, what are these cuts that I'm talking about? Well, the cuts that we're talking about today are a direct result of the 2012 budget from the Conservatives, but since coming to power, the Conservatives have had the CBC and Radio-Canada in their sights. They appointed Conservatives to top management positions and instructed them to literally take an axe to the institution. As a direct result of the actions by now Conservative but also previous Liberal governments, CBC Radio-Canada has been weakened. At the same time, it's trying to survive in an extremely competitive television market and struggling to transform and keep up with the 21st century technology. New Democrats question whether the CBC and Radio-Canada can actually fulfill its mandate under the current conditions, particularly in respect of the regions and minority language communities. And we so badly need these voices to knit our country together and not allow us to build on our differences, but rather to celebrate our differences. It's disappointing that the new Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages seems to be pursuing the Conservative approach of abandoning this important Canadian institution. The NDP believes in the importance of our public broadcaster. CBC Radio-Canada should have an adequate, stable budget that affords it a measure of predictability. This would make it less susceptible to the whims of the advertising market and less affected by political influence, I might say, because they don't have to be as concerned about the government of the day. But you know, these cuts, Mr. Speaker, are having a huge impact on the staff at CBC. We're losing hundreds of young people, good people who are the future of our broadcasting, people who can make a huge difference for this country. I want to just quote Lyndon McIntyre, the host of The Fifth Estate, who's talking about the 657 people who will lose their jobs under these cuts. And he's someone who stepped down in order to save one more job of a young person. And Mr. McIntyre has been a Canadian treasure in his role as host of the Fifth Estate. When he said these 657 people are young, bright, talented, they represent the future of the CBC. If we start losing them at this point, we're losing the future. It's a tragedy, it's a human tragedy, and it's an institutional tragedy. And I suppose it's not just pushing it to say it's a national tragedy. I agree, Mr. Speaker. I believe that these cuts to CBC are indeed a national tragedy. But it's not just the Conservatives, as I said, who have been making these cuts. It should be said that while it was in power in the 1990s, the Liberals imposed cuts on CBC and Radio-Canada to the tune of $400 million, and almost 2,500 people lost their jobs. The Chrétien era is generally accepted as the time when the troubles of the CBC and Radio-Canada began, and so it is on this terrible base of cuts, this history of cuts, that we're seeing these further cuts by the Conservatives today. And what is this meaning to our major broadcaster? As I said, young talent is being lost, but we're also losing voices of Canadians. We're losing regional programming. We're losing diverse programming across this country. And we're dropping in our ranking around the world. Among the 18 major Western countries, Canada ranks 16th, third from the bottom in terms of per capita public funding for public broadcasters, just ahead of New Zealand and the United States. Mr. Speaker, that's a sad, sad testimony to the lack of support given to our public broadcaster. This is a very important issue right across this country, but let me say in my community and in my riding of Parkdale-High Park, it has been a huge issue. I've received hundreds and hundreds of emails and calls and letters from community members very, very concerned about this series of cuts. And I just want to quote a couple of these letters. One of them from a constituent named Joe, who's talking about now having advertising on CBC Radio. He writes, I just heard the first ads on CBC Radio. Consider this a howl of outrage. Promise me the NDP will establish stable funding for the national public broadcaster so that we may be spared further erosion of this once mighty institution. What's next? Billboards on the side of the Parliament buildings? That's Joe. Joe, you can rest assured that the NDP will restore funding to the CBC. I want to quote one other letter from a constituent named Kathy, and she's copied me on a letter to the Prime Minister. And this was about budget changes in 2012, and she writes to the Prime Minister, your disrespect for the intelligence of the Canadian people is transparent when you challenge the value of the CBC. At election time, you suggested you would support continued funding for the CBC, but when handed a majority, you worked to deconstruct an internationally respected network on the basis that it threatens your ideology. To lose the CBC, or worse, make it a propaganda machine for any standing government, is an offence to our democracy and evidence of your disassociation with the history of this vast nation and the irreplaceable role that the CBC has played in maintaining our ties as a nation. Decades of increasingly depleted funding and staffing at upper echelons of executive offices prepare to dismantle the CBC, managing it as if it were a private company, continues to undermine the CBC's unique mandate to connect Canadians. Shame on you. Thank you, Kathy, for that letter, and I echo those words. Shame on you. Mr. Speaker, the NDP motion today is calling for stable, predictable, long-term funding for the CBC. Let's not attack our national broadcaster. Let's treasure it, preserve it, improve it, and leave it there for future generations for the benefit of all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Sault Ste. Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For you, I'd like to ask the honourable member with respect to this motion, if I'm going to support it, I really would like to clearly understand your definition of adequate and stable funding. Can you give me a dollar value in terms of what that is?
Order. Order. The member for Sault Ste. Marie should be aware that the questions have to be directed to the chair, to the speaker, not to the member the question is going to. I'm not sure if you've completed. If you do, you still.
Ask the honourable member if she could please explain to me what exactly, in terms of a dollar figure, adequate and stable funding is in the minds of the member opposite. Thank you.
The honourable member for Parkdale-High Park.
Well, as the honourable member knows, only the government can actually direct funding from this House, so the opposition cannot, in fact, identify a specific amount or dictate what we think the dollar amount should be. As he well knows, the opposition does not have that ability. We are not crafting a budget, but if the honourable member just waits until 2015, when the NDP is elected the Government of Canada, we'll be happy to give him a dollar amount for the CBC.
Question et commentaire. The
Questions and comments?
Kingston and the Islands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I'd like to answer the previous question in asking my question. I mean, why don't we bring it back to where the funding was in 2006 when the Conservative government was elected? I mean, that's a proposal. I think that, you know, any election platform will have to be fully costed, and you will have to put a dollar amount to what you want to spend on different things. I don't think that my honourable colleague's answer was sufficient. You know, you do have to say, when you put together your election platform, this is what we intend to spend, here's what it costs, here's where the revenue is going to come from, and here's our plan with the dollars. And I want to give my honourable colleague a chance to respond to that.
The honourable member for Parkdale-High Park.
Well, I'll tell the honourable member what we won't do. Unlike the Liberals, we won't cut $400 million from the CBC, and we won't lay off 2,500 hard-working employees of the CBC. And if he's patient and he waits, when we're in a federal election and we have an election platform, as he knows, every platform is fully costed, and then we'll lay out exactly what our plans will be for the CBC. And I'm sure Canadians will prefer the approach of the CBC by the New Democrats over what either the Conservative or Liberal record has been over the last 15 years.
Question et commentaire. Questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Pierre-Boucher. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like first of all to congratulate my colleague for her eloquent speech, which indeed concentrated or focused on perspectives of people that she has heard from. I'd also like to remind people that the other parties have fun saying, well, what does that mean, how many millions? But really, what we're talking about is $45 million, so that's about $1.50 per Canadian. As everyone knows, the debate's very clear. We are now at $29 per Canadian, and it used to be $34. I think everybody can count here. So what does my colleague think that motivates people? We have 25,000 people who signed the NDP petition. Why are people so passionate about the CBC? The honourable member for Parkdale-High Park. Once again, I'd like to thank my colleague from Longueuil-Pierre-Boucher for his question and for all of his work on behalf of CBC Radio-Canada. And indeed, what motivates my constituents in my riding is their pride in Canada, their passion for communicating, their passion for the arts, for news. They really enjoy the information that they receive from the CBC, which is impartial, that we don't find in the private sector, and that reaches out to every corner of this country and reaches out to all Canadian voices. So I think that it's this pride and passion for our country that is really what is involved in the support for CBC Radio-Canada here. It's why it's so important that we provide appropriate funding to this institution, this public institution.